opportunity to talk to you. This is a slightly different angle, obviously, that I'm going to present than the previous ones, but it kind of fits into the broader puzzle as well, I think. As the title suggests, this paper grapples with Russian troop withdrawal from the Baltic republics in the early 90s. Ronnie already mentioned that this is a book chapter, part of a bigger book. I have to say I'm not a historian and I do not intend to pretend to be one, but when writing this chapter I have spent countless days in dark rooms with declassified materials, hundreds of American materials, documents, and Baltic one as well. So with that being said, let me put the cards on the table. What is the argument of this chapter? I think there's not much of a mystery here. The title kind of gives it away. I'm arguing that outside parties, above all, Washington played a crucial role in mediating this military divorce, if you can put it that way, in the Baltic countries. On the US side of things, George Bush had spearheaded the process, but while he was supportive of the Baltic Soviet troop withdrawal, he was not putting much of a political effort in all of that. That would change with Clinton coming to power. He would be more forthcoming on those matters. So big picture, the declassified documents tell a story of intense back and forth between Moscow, Washington, and the Baltic republics being in the middle of it all. Of course, I don't want to oversimplify things. Just because this chapter talks about American role in solving the issue doesn't mean that there was only one country that was involved in this. Sweden, led by energetic and young Carl Bildt, was a very useful intermediary at that time. He did a lot of work in this regard as well. Obviously, I don't want to personalize too much as well. There are structural forces at play here, Russian domestic politics and early 1990s, America unipolar moment, Russians weak. So these things clearly mattered, so I don't want to underplay them as well. But my point stands. Clinton, I think, played a crucial role in this story. So, slight background here. Official numbers about Soviet troop amounts or numbers are still shrouded in secrecy. I've seen different numbers. The most likely one is around 180,000 troops. What is clear, however, we don't know the precise number. We know that the Soviet army presence in the three Baltic countries was massive. There were cities within the cities, meaning kindergartens, bathhouses, schools, and canteens were built only to accommodate Soviet troops in these countries. During the process of dissolution, the Soviet Union also removed nuclear weapons. That was done in the secret in the early days of Soviet Union crumbling. We also don't know the precise number. There are just estimates how many nuclear weapons there were at that time. You can see the numbers here as well, that some Soviet military occupied pretty substantial chunks of the Baltic territory as well. The relations between local authority and Soviet troops were precarious, to say the best. There were numerous incidents, no time to go in all of these incidents, but there was a very curious one in 1994. Local police officers in Riga, Latvia had tried to evict high-ranking Russian officials at the time. They didn't want to do that, so the local police officers handcuffed them and brought them to a forest. I don't know, you're the historians here, how many instances can you see in history of high-ranking Russian generals being taken hostage? I don't know, there's many. Latvian president intervened immediately and called this misunderstanding. Russian defense minister at the time stated that Russian airplanes were ready to roar and to take a liberation mission. So serious stuff was happening at this time. There were truly bizarre instances as well. Russian control port in Riga, they were doing some technical work on a submarine that was about to be sent to Libya. So not only there were Soviet troops in Latvia, there are also Libyan military officers, which gives you the flavor that how bizarre this situation was. My main point is here that this situation created a highly charged atmosphere in these three Baltic countries. In the early 90s, Western partners, let me see if I skipped one, no. In the early 90s, Western partners initially were rather skeptical about the possibility that all Russian or Soviet, later Russian troops would leave the three Baltic countries. Carl Bildt, again, while extremely supportive of the cause, in one of the declassified cables in the early 90s says, the Baltic countries themselves do not understand how much important this territory is for Russians. They will never give it up. You might become independent, but troops will stay there forever. George Bush, the senior, was quite supportive in principle. There's loads of declassified materials where he basically says that you have the right to get rid of these troops, you have the moral high ground, and so on and so forth. But importantly, he was not willing to foot the bill. There's a meeting between Baltic diplomats in the White House, and Bush starts to talk about kind of random topics of there's a big inflation in America, and the budget is not so good, which Baltic officials kind of come out bewildered. Only later they realize what he meant is through flowers saying, we'll support you, but we'll not pay for this thing. You have to figure out it yourself, basically. You have a quote from US Secretary of State, James Baker, who basically says, we'll watch it from the sidelines. Wish you good luck. We'll prod you, we'll make some calls, but you have to solve this thing between you two. Profound change comes to Washington. And I think that a trove of declassified materials, presidential phone calls, telegrams, diplomatic cables attest that Clinton's coming to power changes the dynamics here. Already on a campaign trail, he had asserted that this will be a priority, one of the priorities, obviously, for Washington. US Deputy Secretary Stroll Talbot, otherwise known as the Russia hand, assures Baltic states that in every single meeting that we have with Moscow, we are raising this issue of Russian troop removal. He's not lying. Having gone through these cables there, when Moscow and Washington talk, Washington often raises this issue of troop removal. One word about Yeltsin. There's a lovely quote by American historian Marie Sharota that in Clinton's eyes, Yeltsin drunk was better than for the United States than most other Russian leaders sober. This is very much the view of the Baltic states. Yeltsin is clearly kind of a volatile negotiating partner. He keeps switching sides. One morning it's da, the other morning it's complete niet. He switches the dates. It is not an easy partner to negotiate. What surprised me that the Baltic lawmakers were quite clear-eyed about the fact that this is their best shot. Whoever comes after Yeltsin will be worse. This was their absolute conviction that this man who might be semi-drunk on some occasions is the best opportunity to get Soviet troops, like the Russian troops, out of the Baltic countries. So how did Washington and Clinton itself manage to grease the wheels of troop removal? I think some of you already mentioned about the housing program. First meeting 1993 in Vancouver, Clinton and Yeltsin negotiate, and there's this quote that Yeltsin raises the issue of poor Russian troops that have no more job and they are living in very bad circumstances, in which he says that, can you imagine, Bill, these troops are now living in tents and these are very awful conditions, and he asks for money. Initial offer was $6 million, to which Yeltsin responds, that is peanuts, that is nothing, we need more. A month later, this increases to 160 million offer to fund Russian housing back in Russia, so the troops can be moved back there. Interestingly enough, not everyone is satisfied with this deal. US Congress has the holder of the purse. There are some lawmakers that interject and say, this is slightly bizarre. We are going to pay for Russian troops. What about our own American troops? We're not paying for their housing. So there are, back and forth between Congress and the White House. In the end, there's a compromise, meaning that Congress agrees to fund this initiative for returning Russian soldiers, but the US president has to certify that there's a progress. So it's not the case that someone will just shovel tons of money and that will disappear and those troops will stay. So that is the deal there. Out of the 3 Baltic countries, Lithuania charges ahead. It manages to get the troops fastest, August 31, 1993. There are a few reasons for that. I have a Lithuanian colleague here, so he might object, but I think first, Lithuanian Russian ethnic minorities are much lower in Lithuania. Secondly, Lithuania didn't have super important strategic objects like Estonia, which had a nuclear submarine facility, and Latvia, which had a radar facility there, which was very important for Russia as well. So back in the day, it's again, history is funny to read. Sometimes Yeltsin used to refer to Lithuania as the good Baltic state. I can assure you, Russians don't think that today of Lithuania. So, but those were the days. In the case of Latvia and Estonia, the things are much more different because Russians use the leverage of ethnic minorities, and they keep pushing this argument that we cannot get all the Russian troops out. Some of them will, the pensioners who have been here for a long time ought to have the privilege to stay in the Baltic countries. 1994, Bill Clinton becomes the first president to set foot in summer 1994 in Riga. Big speech, but he presses the Baltic countries also to compromise on these ethnic questions as well. There's a lot of background diplomatic negotiations between Washington and Moscow. Countless cables of prodding, pushing, encouraging, and you can see the quote here. Clinton writing to Yeltsin, Boris, don't screw this up. You got to get out of Estonia. Everybody is watching. So not only there's a financial incentive, there's also U.S. diplomats made sure to kind of tie the Baltic troop removal together with a broader point, sort of a litmus test of what Russia is. If Russians get out of the Baltics, that would prove that it no longer has these imperialistic ambitions, but if they kind of linger on, that would prove the opposite. So that was one of the points that Americans often made. Estonians had very harsh negotiations in Moscow with Yeltsin. Intriguingly enough, Americans had handed some kind of secret negotiation handbook of how to best deal with Russians, which essentially came down to the point that in negotiations with Russians, you should almost swear at them and be extremely ruthless and not a single step back. I haven't seen that document, but I have spoken to people who, first-hand accounts, who said this was the advice given by former administration. So they managed to strike a deal in the very last weeks, and Russian troops managed to leave. And you can see the quote from Estonian president, who says that Estonian nation will never forget what the Clinton administration did for the country. Last 2 slides. The Russian troop removal undoubtedly was an enormous success story for the 3 Baltic countries. What at some point seemed almost impossible became a reality. But I have to say, when you go back, at the time, this was seen as a messy bargain. The Baltic states didn't get everything they wanted. The agreement was that these thousands of Russian pensioners would stay in the Baltic countries, which would sow the seeds of many problems in the future. So, for example, this ties into a different topic. When the Baltic countries are nearing NATO alliance in 2002, there are lots of Westerners who tell them your intelligence services are awful. Whatever information goes to Riga next day, Moscow reads it. So you need to solve this issue. Americans intervene and basically kind of behind the scenes even suggest that you will not be a NATO country if you do not reform and do that very fast. I think Baltic countries manage, and I think from today's vantage point, countries like Estonia have superb intelligence services, and it's the opposite. We often look at the Western countries with suspicions of what happened to you guys. Conclusion. Again, I think that the big picture, the fact that the Baltic countries managed, with the help of Washington and other European partners, to get Russian troops removed is a massive accomplishment. I think everyone understands in the Baltic countries they would never become NATO members if 100 Russian troops would still be there. It would be totally impossible. So I think this is I'm open to be challenged, but I think this is a good old classic case of US diplomacy at work. So, if you are kind of nostalgic about US diplomacy doing its work with recent elections, this is a nice case study of look back of how things were once and what kind of role Washington could play in diplomatic negotiations. With that being said, thank you very much for listening. I appreciate the